So any questions? Let me actually have John share his thoughts about some of the differences between the new guidelines and the ESC. First, maybe he can explain to us why this divorce happened, because we really like John, and why the ESC wrote their own guidelines and don't work with AHA and ACC again. And I don't want to put him on the spot or anything. And second, maybe he can comment on whether he thinks we really got it wrong, or did we get it right, or can he appreciate the thinking behind some of the differences in these guidelines versus the ESC guidelines?
Well, thank you for that big opportunity. First of all, I think I should try and justify why we are having individual guidelines on each side of the Atlantic. There are a few reasons. One, of course, is the basic medical culture, which is quite different in Europe to the United States. In Europe, we have essentially socialized healthcare systems. We have very little in the way of medical legal issues. We don't practice much defensive medicine, and we have a different attitude towards the general medical process. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that we have a different regulatory system. So, for example, we have available in Europe, we have the left atrial appendage occlusion device. You saw that the ACC and AHA were unwilling to give any recommendations on that device, even though it's used extensively around the world. It's not used specifically as an approved product here in the United States, and therefore the guidelines of the ACC and the AHA, even though they're international in nature, they have ramifications well beyond the shores of North America, did not make any recommendation about left atrial appendage occlusion. And similarly, you could say in the European guidelines that we made absolutely no comment about dofetilide. The reason for that, of course, is that dofetilide is only available in the United States for all intents and purposes. When the drug was initially released, although much of the clinical trial work for dofetilide, the vast majority of it, had been done in Europe, it was not released in Europe. It was approved for use in Europe, but it wasn't released, largely because the sponsor of the drug felt that Europeans could not be trusted to use the drug, whereas Americans could be trusted, and they set up a scheme for making sure that Americans were well qualified to use it, and so on. So the European guidelines don't mention that. There are many other examples of where some therapies are available in Europe and not in North America, and vice versa, and therefore that means that we need slightly different guidelines. Then, of course, there are, I think, society reasons why different guidelines were required. The European Society of Cardiology and the North American societies, the AHA and the ACC together, I think are competitive in the international arena, and therefore need to have their own sort of guideline portfolio. I personally think that that competition is misplaced, but nonetheless I think it was an important factor in why there was a split between those who were contributing to international guidelines. Well, enough said about that. I think what are the main differences between the European guidelines and the American guidelines now? Well, very few compared with prior to the revision in 2014. I think the guidelines have largely come together, and I think in the next iteration of the European guidelines, which will occur in 2016, in June 2016, there will be movement from the European side more towards the American guideline that you now have. And I think in that regard, particularly the rate control issue, for example, which you asked me specifically about, will be readjusted. It wasn't part of the agenda for the 2012 revision, so we didn't further consider it at that time. I think that we have made a slightly more adventurous approach to the novel oral anticoagulant therapy. We wanted very much to acknowledge the fact that over 70,000 patients had been studied in controlled randomized trials with NOACs against dose-adjusted warfarin. Dose-adjusted warfarin, in terms of its effect against placebo, had only been studied in 2,900 patients altogether. And yet dose-adjusted warfarin, of course, has a class 1 recommendation. Here in the United States, warfarin has that recommendation, or I should say vitamin K antagonist, and the NOAC has a class 2A recommendation. That is because the general rule about guidelines in North America state that if there's only one randomized clinical trial regarding any particular therapy, it will only merit a class 2A recommendation, that several RCTs are needed for a class 1 recommendation. Our view about that was to lump NOAC therapy together because they share many similarities, each of the NOACs, and we thought they were more similar than different, and therefore we gave a recommendation for non-VKA oral anticoagulant therapy, of which there were, at the time of writing, 3 trials against dose-adjusted warfarin and 1 trial against aspirin. And we thought it justified a class 1 recommendation. We also thought that warfarin or vitamin K antagonist justified a class 1 recommendation. Now, we gave the NOAC therapy level of evidence A because of these multiple trials, but we said for NOAC therapy that it should be 2A with regard to its general use in anticoagulation, but in patients who were not appropriate for warfarin therapy, it should be class 1. So we made those distinctions. We gave a weak recommendation for a left atrial appendage occlusion device, which the American guidelines did not. With regard to antiarrhythmic drugs, we decided to stick with the notion that we could divide patients into those with underlying substrates, and we retained hypertrophy. We included within the hypertrophy arena the option for using dronedarone. The reason for that being that although there has been no specific study, a large proportion of patients within the Athena trial had left ventricular hypertrophy, and there was no signal of any aggravation or any downside to dronedarone treatment in those patients. For heart failure, we removed dronedarone completely, and we have only amiodarone available because we don't have dofetilide. In the American guidelines, I don't believe dronedarone is completely outlawed in heart failure, but it's not available at all in Europe for both regulatory and guideline reasons. So I think that those are the main distinctions now between the guidelines. They are not very many, and I think we're much closer than we were.
What do you think about this sunsetting of lone AFib? I think actually that was probably started by your guidelines, but are you supportive of that notion that that term is largely a historic term? And second, this sort of simplified approach to defining paroxysmal versus persistent AFib, I think that's about the same as your guidelines, but do you have any comments about that?
Well, first of all, I think that lone atrial fibrillation is an apologetic diagnosis in philosophical terms. It simply means you haven't discovered its cause, and we know that the more we look, the more we can find a cause for atrial fibrillation, and therefore I generally approve of the notion that we should get rid of that terminology. It just obfuscates the need to find a cause for atrial fibrillation and allows people not to look. So I totally agree with that change. With regard to the, what was the other thing you asked me?
The paroxysmal, 7 days, more than 7 days.
I actually like the definition that you first introduced in the heart rhythm consensus document of distinguishing between atrial fibrillation that you purposefully terminate within 48 hours, in which case I think you should probably still refer to that as paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. Whereas if it lasts beyond 48 hours and is terminated within the 7 days, I think it could be more likely to be persistent, and therefore I put it in that category. But I think the next guidelines will probably dispense with the notion of distinguishing paroxysmal and persistent atrial fibrillation. Probably will use completely different criteria to classify atrial fibrillation. But for the time being, I think we're stuck with the 3P classification.
Al?
Wonderful discussion from superb people. Just to say a thing about rate control, if you look at the Race 2 trial, which used 110 beats per minute or lower as the only reference point, and that was adopted by the ESC. When you really look at the data, the average resting rate was 86 beats per minute, which is very little different from Race 1 where it was 84. And if you look in the strict arm in Race 2, the average resting rate was resting rate was 76. So they're in the same ballpark. It really says to me as a clinician, which I like, if you're less than 90 beats per minute, you know, you're probably okay. Not too many people were above 100, and even a little above 90, you don't have to get your bowels in an uproar. You could just kind of look a little. So I don't think that the two are very far apart, really. If you really look at what happened, so if you use 110, it looks kind of strange. But if you really see what happened, 86 versus 76 is in the strict versus lenient versus strict in Race 2. That's I think a better way to think about it as a clinician.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Thank you. I do have a question for you. I think I remember when I was looking at survey, I was there, regarding the clinical equipoise for RCT comparing catheter ablation versus medic therapy. For those patients with, highly selected, persistent patients who have failed class 1 and 3 AAD. Since you don't have a keypad, I don't feel that you get a chance to vote for that. My recollection was that even though those percentages, there are more audience feel that there's no clinical equipoise for such a selected patient with persistent AFib, but the difference was really kind of small. And what was your opinion if you get a chance to vote? And also, I think this is relevant to the recent update in the 2014 AFib guideline regarding the recommendation for persistent AFib, catheterization for persistent AFib, highly selected. And then I think it's intertwined, so I wanted to, I'm curious.
Yeah, no, I mean, I thought your presentation was really terrific, and basically, this is the discussion that I guess you have all the time with every different company that shows up, trying to get this, this labeling for persistent AFib. It's a little striking that it's been 5 years since we first had a catheter approved for paroxysmal AFib, and to this day, there's still not an ablation catheter approved for persistent AFib. You're right, it's a sort of a major need that's out there. And I think you nicely presented the issue. We all love prospective randomized trials if you can get them done. That's obviously the easiest to interpret the results. And that and I think the approach that I know the FDA uses is to say, well, these are the alternatives. The alternatives is to pick a success rate and pick a complication rate and hit that mark, which is harder to interpret that data. I thought your survey was very informative, which told me that if someone was going to design a study of persistent AFib where after a first episode or whatever, your first treatment is either drugs or ablation, there seemed to be a lot of, everyone sort of didn't know quite what to do with that group, sort of first-line catheter ablation, if you will. First-line catheter ablation for persistent AFib, people seem to be quite supportive of, whereas once you failed the drug with persistent AFib, there seemed to be a lot less enthusiasm for randomizing those patients to another drug, or catheter ablation. So I think that was very sort of informative, interesting data for those that are designing studies of this patient population.
So I realized that you are on the writing committee of the 2014 guideline, and then can you share some light in terms of how the evidence was looked, and then how you, the committee was looking at the evidence, and then develop or make a conclusion on the, what type of recommendation for catheter ablation may fit for persistent AFib patients?
Well, I'll just make a few comments about the document, and the AHA and the ACC have adopted a whole new process for guidelines that's very, very strict in terms of conflict of interest. and the requirements, I think, are also different than in Europe. I think that's one of the differences, that someone like John Cam would never be allowed to be the first author of a guideline in the U.S. in this day and age, because if you have any relationship with industry, you're crossed off the list. You can't possibly be the first author of that document. And I used to not have conflicts, and that's why I was on that writing group. But so that's a major difference. So as a result, of the writing committee members, half have to have no conflicts of interest with any company involved in the AFib space, more than half. And then when you have any of the recommendations that are made, only members of the writing group that don't have conflicts can vote on that. So you may have a writing group of 12 people, of which 7 have no conflicts. And so you need more than 50% of those 7 to get that approved as a 2A or a 1-at-1. So it's a very strict sort of approach. The other part of these guidelines, which is interesting, is a first draft of any part of the guideline can never be written by anyone with a conflict of interest in that area. So again, it's the non-conflicted members have to do all the initial drafting of the document, and then editing by folks that may have conflicts. And then it has this, anyhow, it's a very rigid, strict approach, and you can argue, is this good, is this bad? But and then when it comes down to making these recommendations, as John pointed out, you have to review all the literature, you have to cite all the references, and they have very strict rules about when you can call someone in class 1 or whatever. I mean, what I liked about this, one of the things I liked about this new document is the recommendations as they pertain to catheter ablation align perfectly with the ESC recommendations, which align perfectly with the consensus document. And the consensus document's the one document we have that it's a worldwide document where Europe and the US, everyone still works together. We have more liberal conflict of interest rules in that document, allowing us to get all the, many of the thought leaders in the world to put their heads together to grapple with these tough issues. So I think that continues to be an important document, and I certainly hope that they will be redrafted in another year or 2, and we'll have another large writing group involved with that.
Thanks. Question.
I think it's also important to point out that the European scheme is moving much more towards the American system, and conflict of interest is now a big issue within European guidelines, and we have similar rules about 50% not having any conflicts. We also have the need for at least one of the co-chairs of the guidelines to have no conflicts. As far as I'm aware, there is as yet no particular requirement for who writes the first draft of this, that, or the other. But the European guidelines from 2013 onwards are much closer in terms of their conflict of interest restrictions to the American system.
I mean, I know the Heart Rhythm Society is sort of somewhere in between, so it's like the ESC guidelines, where of the 2 co-chairs of the document, one has to be conflict-free, but it doesn't say you can't write and put pen to paper if you have conflicts. But thank you. Yes.
I was wondering, do you think there's a problem with the new guidelines now allowing the NOACs to be used in the setting of electrical cardioversion, and yet I think that would be considered an off-label use? I don't think it's an FDA approved.
When it comes to cardioversion, we had a lot of discussion about, do we break down it separately for warfarin versus the NOACs, and we basically lumped them and said that you can anticoagulate with whatever. There'd been, I think, 2 studies done, but the fact that they aren't specifically approved for that indication. I mean, I think the therapy is approved, is available in the US by an FDA, as an FDA-approved indication. And then we're talking about an approved therapy for another indication, which is allowed. It's like catheter ablation. Catheter ablation is FDA approved for paroxysmal AFib, and we make recommendations for persistent AFib, even though there isn't any official approval. So I think it sort of follows the same pattern.
My question,
Yeah.
question to Hugh and John, being from the guideline committee. The new recommendation and guidelines give a class 2A recommendation to catheter ablation for paroxysmal AFib as a first-line treatment. For most of us in real world, we don't think that for most patients, catheter ablation is a reasonable first-line treatment. So, certainly there's no large-scale evidence demonstrating clear advantage or even equal effectiveness and safety. But would like to get your perspective on that. What was the rationale for giving this recommendation as a first-line treatment for paroxysmal AFib patients?
Okay, John, why don't you...
I'll start with that. The fact was that catheter ablation was being offered as first-line therapy, specifically for paroxysmal atrial fibrillation patients. Now, we had to decide whether we would write a recommendation that condemned that, or whether we could write any kind of recommendation which was supportive. We had available to us at the time the RAFT pilot study, the MANTRA PAF study, and the unpublished results of the RAFT study, which were subsequently published by just blocking.
Carlos.
By Carlos, yes, thank you. So we had that amount of information available, and it was all pretty consistent. The one problem was that MANTRA PAF missed its primary outcome. Its primary outcome being consistent improvement of superiority of AF burden throughout the trial. And it was only significantly positive in favor of ablation late in the trial and not throughout the trial. And so that was a difficulty, but on the other hand, the trials had all demonstrated that the safety issues were similar between drugs and device and ablation therapy. They hadn't, of course, ablation therapy had a different spectrum of adverse events, but in all there wasn't much difference between them. And we thought initially that we could give this a Class 2B recommendation, which we did in 2010, and then we upgraded that to 2A recommendation when we had all three of those trial data available to us. But we maintained it at 2A and we didn't give it a Class 1 recommendation. And there's therefore no compulsion on anybody to move to first-line therapy with ablation, but it did give some support to those who favored that therapy over antiarrhythmic drug approaches.
You know, one of the nice things about your document, John, is the beautiful figures that you had, and the figure clearly shows a dotted line towards ablation, solid line towards drugs, sort of in a figuratively way, pushing people to try drugs first. So I think your approach, Amir, is right on target. Virtually all my patients, I'll try drugs first, unless this patient specifically wants to go straight to ablation, which is not unreasonable. Okay, well, I think it's late. I want to thank everyone and remind everyone that tomorrow at 7 a.m. is the live cases from all over the world, including China. So you don't want to miss it, but Jeremy's coming up to